Thanks for the very kind introduction, Ravi. And good afternoon to all of you, and thanks for coming down and um, joining us here. I thought I'd talk a bit about security threats to Singapore today. I think, if you read the papers or watch the news, a couple of days ago, the Malaysian authorities, just as leaders from 10 ASEAN countries were meeting in KL, the Malaysian authorities uncovered a cell that was planning attacks with car bombs around the KL area. Um, the terror threat has been with us for 10 years, 15 years in this region, and I'm sure you're aware of that. But I thought I'd kind of since we're celebrating SG50 this year, ST is also celebrating its 170th anniversary this year. There'll be more in July. Um, I thought, I'd look back much wider and kind of, Singapore's not always been around. Um, 700 years ago, it was called Temasek, and some of the themes that I think affect our security today, as it affected our survival then, are still quite relevant today. Sorry, let me figure this out. Yep. Okay. About 700 years ago, Temasek became Singapore when legend has it that Sang Nila Utama came and sort of saw a lion and called it Lion City. Um, the evidence is a little hazy, I think, on some of the actual dates and facts. But the British, when Raffles came in 1819, um, blew up the Singapore Stone, which was, I think, at the mouth of the Singapore River then, and part of the Singapore Stone is still exhibited at the National Museum of Singapore today. Um, and this is a photo from that, but it's one of the earliest examples of evidence to show that Singapore was at least a trading hub in the 1300s, and there was quite a bit of activity going on then. And recent excavations at Fort Canning also highlight that. To the right is gold jewelry from the Majapahit era. That shows that there was trade. There was sort of a king who lived on what's today Fort Canning. What happened then, though, is Singapore's survival didn't go beyond 100 years at the time, because there were at least a couple of invasions, one from the north, from the Thais, and one from Majapahit, which was an empire based in Java. Even when Singapore kind of was quiet, there was activity going on. One of the major incidents happened about 410 years ago, when the Portuguese were already in Malacca and the Dutch wanted, and the Portuguese were controlling trade around the Strait of Singapore. And the Dutch wanted to get a stranglehold on that. And in one incident, a small Dutch fleet basically seized the Portuguese merchant ship off Changi, raising a lot of questions in Europe about whether this was right or not, and so on. But the fact that the battle took place off Singapore kind of showed that this was a real threat that could have affected how the island developed. Straits Times was set up in 1845. And I think looking through its pages over the past 160, 170 years, kind of sheds light on some of the possible security concerns of the authorities at the time. In one of the earliest, and many of the reports then, talked about fights, riots, and so on. One instance was in 1851, when a bunch of secret societies were unhappy that some of the land was controlled by rich landowners who happened to be Catholic, and so there were some riots then. Other riots happened. There were the Hokkien Teochew riots about 150 years ago, and this was a pretty severe case. About 500, 600 people died. Many more were injured, and it was all over secret society allegiances. People were divided along ethnic lines. Another instance was the Singapore Mutiny, about 100 years ago, when a garrison of soldiers, upon being told that they might be sent to Turkey to fight the Ottoman Empire, didn't quite like the idea, and they were actually going to be sent to Hong Kong. But what happened after that was they kind of took control of their garrison and mutinied against the British soldiers. Um, there was sort of unrest in the city for a few days. This photo shows a bunch of them. About I think 50 of them were eventually um, put on trial quite hastily and then executed. Um, 70 years ago, Singapore was, invaded by the Japanese. The occupation lasted 3 years. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the Japanese surrender. But again, it was a reminder that I think war and conflict are a perennial security concern. Communal riots are another issue. The Maria Hertog riots in 1950 and the communist threat in the 1950s, which lasted for about 20 or 30 years. This photo is actually of a bomb that went off, a car bomb that went off in Katong. Fortunately, no civilians were killed, although a couple were injured, and the bombers I think one of them was injured and later captured, but two of them, yeah. Racial riots in 1964 were a real security risk. I think 20 something deaths as well. I'm sure most of you would have been familiar with the McDonald House bombing during Konfrontasi when Indonesia opposed the formation of Malaysia, which Singapore was then a part of. This is another incident. I think Singapore is a major trading hub and major port, and this naturally has made it a target for terrorists over the years. And in the Laju incident, what happened was 2 Japanese Red Army terrorists and 2 Palestinian militants actually tried to attack the oil facilities on Pulau Bukom. They didn't succeed, but they ended up capturing a ferry and basically holding the 5 crew members hostage. And this basically shows, basically other ships were in the area, police boats stormed them. What happened was a very tense standoff, and eventually they negotiated and were escorted to Kuwait, where they were just handed over. This is another incident when 4 militants kind of took control of a flight from Kuala Lumpur to Singapore and basically held the crew hostage, and they basically threatened to, kill the passengers and crew one by one if their demands were not met. It was a tense 7 or 8 hour standoff, and eventually what happens was commandos stormed the plane and rescued the remaining, basically shot the hijackers and rescued the hostages. But hijacking, in an era where Changi sees several hundred flights a day, hijacking is a very real threat. Again, what happens in our neighboring countries can affect our security. Political unrest in Indonesia in '98, for example, it affected the stock market here. It affects investors' confidence in the region. And more recently, I think the terror threat. This photo shows Mas Slamat, who was the leader of the GI cell in Singapore and fled, but he was then rearrested and captured. But one of his plots was he planned to hijack a plane and fly it into Changi Airport. I think if we talk about security as well, you got to look beyond things like terrorism, but certain other things. The SARS epidemic, for instance, in 2003, sent the economy into quite a bit of shock as well. There was negative growth for some time. And it kind of, I think Singapore had quite a few healthcare workers, doctors, and ordinary people who lost their lives to this. The Ebola scare, the Ebola scare, which I think is still ongoing, is another reminder that health pandemics can affect security in other ways. I think climate change is another real area that's affected security these days. The floods in Orchard Road were one instance. The haze, it's come in a couple of years ago. There was a particularly bad episode. I think most of us might not see the haze as a traditional security threat, but um, prolonged period of haze could affect traffic into Singapore, could affect visitor arrivals. Um, Internal conflict, I think, is often a key security risk, and some of the themes like riots repeat themselves over the years. But the Little India riot again was an example of how things could go wrong when we least expect it. Um, Again, the terror threat has come up again. Um, these show how ISIS still poses a real threat. Territorial disputes, much like all those years ago, I think the threat of conflict between countries in the area could affect trade and shipping flows into Singapore. It also affects investors' confidence, and I think it affects, in a sense, Singapore's security is also tied to that of the wider region, and whatever disputes affect kind of key neighbors will have some form of spillover impact. We tend not to think about it so much, but again, food scarce, um, water shortage, um, even disruptions in oil supply can impact how secure we feel. And I thought I'd just leave you with this thought. The last few years have seen some of the driest weather on record. Water supplies at our reservoirs were down. Even things like ordinary green patches of grass kind of turned dry. Climate rising sea levels, have affected smaller countries, especially island states in the Pacific, are starting to seriously see rising sea levels as a security threat. Singapore, we may not be as affected, but there are plans to raise, to even look at sea defenses 20 to 30 years down the road to manage the threat. And I think climate change in the longer term, a prolonged period of dry weather could see our security affected in other ways. Okay, with that, I think I'll hand the mic over to Ravi. And
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Zakir. We'd like to invite you to take a seat right here. Okay, this is a chance for you to, of course, ladies and gentlemen, pose your questions. And of course, we'd like to invite you to make your way to the microphones you see on the aisles for you to firstly introduce yourself, tell us which JC you're from. In fact, we know which JC you're from. It's easy to identify with the uniform. But of course, tell us who you are. Zakir, take a seat right here. Moderating this, ladies and gentlemen, from Anderson Junior College, we have, there you go, Miss Helen Cheng. She is the senior GP teacher right at AJC. Let's give her a round of applause.
So we should start, and as you have heard, we would appreciate if you will identify yourself clearly, where you are from, your name, and please keep the questions short, to the point, and within the topic that Mr. Hussein has so kindly delivered a while ago. So can we have the first question, please? The mics are all placed conveniently. Good, we have one.
Hello. Hello. Yeah, hi. I'm Ayush from NYJC. Just a few years back, Singapore had a series of attacks by the anonymous hackers group. And I noticed that there was no mention of any cybersecurity threats in your presentation. So perhaps you could elaborate more on the threats that Singapore faces from cyber attacks and what is being done to prevent such attacks from happening in the future?
Will you please stay there and wait for the answer? Thank you.
Thanks very much for your question, Ayush. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I couldn't manage to cover all the items, but cybersecurity is certainly an important area. Um, we've had a couple of outages. There was a recent incident, I think, some months back, when the database of one of the popular karaoke companies was basically leaked online, and that's a very mild example of that. So much of our transactions are done online, right? 95% of people file our taxes online. Um, any kind of damage to that system and that infrastructure could, I think, see not just a lot of personal data exposed. Um, again, iBanking is another example, right? And we've seen some of these incidents in elsewhere in recent years. So one thing that's been done is, I think, companies and banks and private, um, especially the private sector, is moving towards a greater layer of security against when it comes to transactions done online. Um, but the government's also set up a cybersecurity agency. In fact, it was just opened, I think, earlier this. It was officially established in early April, and it aims to basically survey and test all these a whole host of online functions to make sure that they're safe from attacks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can we have the next one, please?
Good afternoon. I'm Dexter from Anderson Junior College. And my question is, in the event of a terrorist attack by religious fundamentalists on Singapore, what would be the political and social fallout?
Thanks for the question, Dexter. I think um, that's I think a big security question. I think it's often been said that the first, in a sense, the first threat is not the first bomb or series of bombs that go off, but the second fallout, where I think you're likely to see growing tension between people in general, and I think members of the same religious group where, behind the attack. And I think the government's quite aware of that, which is why I think even after the first JI attacks even after the first JI plots that were disrupted in 2001, it quite consciously went around to try and strengthen the links between community organizations. And at every neighborhood, every constituency, you see groups of people, essentially religious leaders from different backgrounds, coming together to help explain to one another, in a sense, to reduce misunderstanding and build greater trust. That when when an attack goes off, it often doesn't have. It's basically by fundamentalists who abuse of certain religion. And I think in a lot of cases today with ISIS and so on, it's often extremists who misuse Islamic teachings. That's an important part of what's being done. But again, it's hard to say, and I think the test will come when an attack does happen, or should it happen.
Thank
Yeah.
you, sir.
Who shall be next? Come on. I think the topic is interesting. We cover it in our GP. All right. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Reef from Raffles Institution. I first like to thank Mr. Zaki for the presentation. My question is: Will increased political participation from other political parties hinder or affect our national security?
Thanks. I think that's an interesting question. I think the two schools of thought with that. And I think there's no right or wrong answer, but I think some people still view that as in a way as a threat to could view that as a threat to national security, in the sense that Singapore at the end of the day is a very small country, and the more fragmented or divided it is, the dangers of the government not being able to push a certain course of action that is in Singapore's security interests could potentially affect our security, right? Take, for instance, Singapore's participation in the international coalition against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. It's something that, because of the political setup here, has allowed for action to be taken decisively. You might argue that if we had a more fractured parliament, it might have made that course of action longer, or it might cause certain laws that we have, like the Internal Security Act, to be reviewed. So I think from that point of view, you could see that as a possible, I wouldn't say threat, but it might make certain security decisions require more time and complexity. But on the other hand, I mean, a more complex, system with wider political representation or more political parties might not necessarily mean that when it comes to security issues, decision making could be quite slow. I think you've seen in other countries, in the UK, in the US, when it comes to certain national security decisions, there's often quite unanimous consensus on a certain course of action.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'm wondering whether it's proper if I ask a question. So my question is, following what you told our audience, Singapore is part of the coalition forces to fight against ISIS. So I recall that Prime Minister Lee made this at the end of a press conference after his visit to Turkey. So was that discussed at the parliamentary level, or was it taken kind of unanimously, unilaterally? I'm not sure. So maybe you can better enlighten me and the audience. Thank you.
Thanks. I think it wasn't raised in Parliament. As far as I recall, that decision was not made in Parliament, but it was certainly discussed at cabinet level, as most decisions are. But I think it was also fully within the remit of the government to make that decision. I think there were a couple of questions in Parliament on that subsequently, but I think no one quite questioned it. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, more questions from you young people who are listening to Mr. Hussein. It's your chance to ask before the quiz begins. Any more? Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. My question is about
Your name,
Oh,
please?
sorry. My name is Jaren. I'm from NYJC.
Okay.
My question directs towards nuclear power. I understand that Singapore has not been very interested in the pursuit of nuclear power, but how do you think the interest of other countries towards developing nuclear power for their own countries affect our security?
Thanks for that. That's an interesting question. Although I have to add though, although Singapore has not been actively considering nuclear power, it's a member of, it's attended nuclear security conferences and made its representations known on these levels. I think Indonesia at least has floated the idea, although not as seriously, the idea of basically exploring a nuclear power plant. Or nuclear power as an alternative to energy, to meeting its energy requirements. Nuclear power per se, I think, is not a threat, but you've got to be quite mindful of the potential for a disaster to happen from a nuclear power plant is much larger than, say, from a geothermal power plant or a conventional power plant. You've seen, even though Chernobyl was many decades ago, it's the impact of a nuclear disaster has lasting, I think, consequences. From that sense, it's still a possible danger.
Right. Thank you very much.
Who next? Come.
Hi, I'm Chloe from NYJC. Can you share experiences interviewing the JI members?
Okay, sure. No, thanks for that question. It took quite a bit of time. I think I had to add that both of these members were quite sufficiently rehabilitated. I interviewed Ali Imran, one of the Bali bombers, about 2012, as part of a package we did on the 10th anniversary of the Bali bombs. Right. This was, and in fact, it kind of goes back to Singapore as well, because the plot in Singapore was foiled, and it was quite a signature plot that they wanted to do. They set their eyes on somewhere else, and naturally, a soft target that they felt they could carry out successfully was in Bali, and 200 civilians, mostly Australians, died in those attacks. About 150 were injured, and so on. The Indonesian police apprehended several dozen of the actors and people behind that attack. They were put on trial and so on. And Ali Imran was one of the bombers who, although he took a fairly active role in the attack, he always had reservations about it. They were concerned about civilian casualties, and he never quite resolved this moral dilemma, even when he was involved. So when they nabbed the terrorists and kind of interrogated them and so on, he was fairly cooperative. And because he assisted police in investigations quite a bit, he got a life sentence, but he was detained in a police holding cell in police headquarters. And what he'd do was he'd help when each time they caught new terrorists or new militants, they'd use him to try and approach them, to try and see if they would cooperate and share information and actually prevent more lives from being lost. And I think the thing about Ali was, when I spoke to him with my colleagues, he was fairly remorseful, I'd say. He even teared up when he recounted how every time he sees of the loss of lives in a terror attack, he kept kind of questioning whether this was really what God would want him to do, whether this was what, whether it was right to do that. And I think his, but he also was at the same time, I think, quite how would I say it? In fact, he saw it as his duty to try and help, speak out and help prevent other would-be militants from carrying out plots. And I thought his example was, I think, how do I put it? It's an instructive way of how to fight, terrorism in a way. Because terrorists, at the end of the day, are radicalized by ideas, but they're not always. They don't always cling on, like most people. They don't always cling on to the same set of beliefs or views throughout their lives, and in a way, what Singapore and some of the authorities in the region are trying to do is to, even with people who may have traveled abroad to fight or been radicalized online, you try and persuade them and convince them and engage them to change their beliefs so that you avert a terror threat that way. In a way, you can't just, execute, or you can't just detain indefinitely a person who's had radical beliefs for long. You need to try and persuade him that even as you keep an eye on him, maybe for the rest of his life, you've got to try and persuade him that what he did believe in was wrong, right? And try and rewire that some way. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
It was okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I just make a comment, Mr. Hussein? Did it help the fact that you are Malay when you were interviewing these GI members?
Maybe, although I think I'm trying to think. I think the fact that he was reformed helped. I mean, I've spoken to others who weren't active members but who were pretty radicalized, and it didn't matter, because when they see even though you look like them, so long as you don't believe in the radical ideas they do, they see you as as good as an outsider. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, can we have the next question, please? I'm sure there are things burning in your mind you would like to ask, so don't be shy. Just come to the mic, identify yourself, and then get Mr. Hussein to enlighten us more. Come.
Okay, I'm Jason. I teach GP here. I hope this question is not going to be too confrontational.
No.
Okay, in the light of the threats to the security of the country, right, has the media here, especially the mainstream media, that is SPH, has there been a need to rethink the OB markers that we know about? Like, for example, just last few days, it's nothing to do with the mainstream media, but the behavior of the SCDF officers, I think they were actually doing what they were doing. So I was just reading it, and immediately there were people who was talking about Malay and so on and so forth. So in the light of such kind of comments that can be made on social media, which can potentially harm the harmony down here, right? Has the media got to be even more watchful about what they highlight, what they actually emphasize in the reports and things like that? Yeah.
Thanks for the question. No, I think we've always been quite careful, and sometimes we do take special caution, especially where issues like race and religion are involved. But I think sometimes the nature of comments on some online sites can be quite free flowing, and sometimes they are moderated, right? But even, for instance, when you go through a Straits Times Facebook page, offensive comments are pulled off, and you could call it censored, but for a justified reason, I think. I mean, I hope. But when it comes to actually putting something in print or even for our online editions, I think we do exercise special caution. So, for instance, issues like ethnicity and race, right? We've never kind of made reference to race when it comes to describing a person, unless it's for unless it's say for a unless it's to do with a community issue, or when it's when the issue is about race. And I think, yeah, we do have to be more mindful of that, let's say.
Alright.
Yeah, not sure if that helped.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I think it did. Then, if that's the case, then maybe one more potentially confrontational question.
Sure.
How about then
No,
the
that's-
how about then the counterpoint, the opposition that maybe we shouldn't actually sweep some of these things under the carpet, and
Yeah.
maybe discuss some of these things regarding racism, regarding homosexuality and things like that in a more open manner. I know that of course nothing to do with the
Sure,
security,
none-
whatever, yeah.
Yeah.
So how about the counterpoint that perhaps the press role should actually be to foster open and transparent discussion about such things, rather than try to sugarcoat it, so to speak.
No, I think that's also an interesting point, and I hope we've. Sometimes the press has been, accused, or readers do feel that we might be pushing some of these discussions too openly, I'd say as well.
Alright.
It's always controversial. Say on the issue of homosexuality, ever since the Aware saga, and then you had the Wear White campaign last year that caught on, and I think Pink Dot's coming up in June again. So
Okay.
these issues are going to constantly surface. You had the issue of the IKEA ads. I think the press has a role in I think pushing some of these discussions and raising some of these issues. But I think sometimes it's might be safer to be a little cautious on this. I think in terms of social issues like homosexuality, I think there's a sense sometimes the press is leading too liberal. Yeah, it's
Okay.
I think
Yeah.
going a bit more than maybe what the majority of readers or people in society might be comfortable with.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think when it comes to race and religion and difference and the press, I think we've been, I think, a bit behind in terms of what people are ready to discuss openly, and
All right.
yeah,
Okay. Thank you.
yeah.
We have one coming, right? Good. Please.
Hi, I'm Lucas from SRJC. Just wanted to ask, right? We all know that terrorism is a really long-standing problem. It's nearly impossible to solve. The current hard approach towards it, like for example, airstrikes or sending troops on the ground,
Yeah.
seems to just be a short-term solution. How then can the global community work hand in hand to actually solve it right at its cause? Because the short-term solution seems to just be aggravating the problem.
No, I think it's a very valid question, and I think Singapore's approach has always been that you can't fight it the hard approach itself. You do need, various initiatives. Earlier this month, Singapore hosted this East Asia Summit on religious rehabilitation and social reintegration. And I think you had about 600 people from 30 countries in the region, the US, come around and discuss ways of, in a way, unwiring or rewiring radicals, so that fewer of them feel drawn to violent ideology. And at the same time, people who might return from Syria and Iraq, you've got what? More than 500 people from Indonesia, more than 100 from Malaysia who've traveled, at least 2 who are known to be from Singapore who've traveled there. When they do return, I guess naturally they might be detained for a while in some countries. But you can't detain them indefinitely, right? Even the ISA, you've got a shelf life of 2 years, and you need to keep renewing and give, even though you give it behind closed door, you need to put up valid reasons or grounds for their continued detention. And the soft approach, I think, is employed that way. But even with, I think, on the flip side, some of these airstrikes are necessary because um, people in some of the areas who are affected, by the radicals do feel that they need that support and help from the international community in pushing them back. And I think the international campaign's also seen slow but some successes because you've at least confined the area the radicals control to a certain area.
All right, thank you.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Sam. I'm the OM of AJC. Strange you get an OM asking a questions.
Not at all.
Just need your enlightenment. I'm just wondering, all these present threats going on right now, it somehow happen to be between the Muslims and maybe the Christian groups, or I'm not too sure. So perhaps you can just give us a little bit the historical perspective of how this thing actually evolved and from when it started to be in that way. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. I think, yeah, and the question is, where do I start now? Let me start now and then move backwards, and then it might be easier that way. A German news magazine, Spiegel, recently put out quite a detailed investigative report, and I think a story on how, they actually traced back some of the ISIS commanders, right? And most of them were actually people from Saddam Hussein's army who basically lost their jobs with the invasion in 2003. And a lot of them were already, were just exploiting religion and religious grievances to kind of push forward their agenda. And then one thing led to another. You had Syria, you had the Syrian government, which was quite repressive, suppressing democratic opposition, and somehow they got together, and it sort of becomes an explosive cocktail of part of it also, I think. How do I go back this way? I think it was more pronounced in the, I'd say, last few decades, especially when you find the new wave in the 1980s. Most I think if you see a lot of the books that are out there and a lot of the material, this new wave only surfaced in the 80s, right? When you had the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan, and the US began sort of giving support to rebels. And often they kind of pitched it as a religious struggle, even though the justification for that was thin. And what happened was that was how Osama bin Laden conveniently could set up camp in Afghanistan in the 80s and 90s. That was where a lot of the JI radicals from this region actually went to train in the late 90s as well. And even after the Soviet Union pulled out of Afghanistan in 88, 89, you had a base, I guess, where a lot of these radical ideas could nurture. Right? And I was just looking at, video clips or footage of Afghanistan or Kabul in the 70s. Very different from what it is today or even in the 90s. And suddenly, because these militants, were seen as heroes and so on, they began spreading their religious ideas and began, turning a bit more, taking a slightly more hardline interpretation. And I think that feeds, even if the majority of the people don't feel supportive of it, they tend to give them some credit for the situation. And I think it only then worsened after 9/11. And on one hand, the vast majority of Muslims still do not support or condone terror attacks. But sort of the reaction to that has allowed these radicals to make the argument that, oh, America is targeting Muslims, and it becomes a rallying cry for a small minority.
Well, what
So
about,
the politics gets quite involved. Yeah,
because my thought was, I'm just trying to even go a little bit back.
sure.
Back to the time when Israel was
Yeah.
established
Yeah.
on the land that are deemed to be owned by somebody else.
Yeah.
And I was trying to ask myself, was that the trigger point or that was not?
I think that potentially was a trigger point as well. Although I'm not sure if 48 was it. 67 might have
67,
been. Yeah.
1967.
Yeah. But even in 1967, a lot of the sort of this might be a bit too. A lot of the Palestinian groups like PFLP, right, was actually led by, if I'm not wrong, a Palestinian Christian who, and Palestine, as you know, is very religiously complex, and you have secular Palestinian opposition, and you also have the slightly more militant Hamas side of things. But Palestine, I think, becomes an easy issue for a lot of these hardline groups. If you look at their websites or their literature, even the slightly more hardline groups in this region, cite Palestine and as an issue, even though among Palestinians themselves, there's this internal struggle about whether you want a more secular or more fundamentalist state, I'd say. But it's complex, I think. Yeah.
All right.
I'm not sure if that's helped, but
That's okay.
I think it's an interesting question, and I think it's something that's raised. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Any more, please? All right, here we have. Okay, we let ladies first, please. So come along.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Shahira. I'm from SRJC. My question is, in a criminal justice system, is rehabilitation an effective measure for national security, or should we solely adopt a harsh measure towards threats?
Thanks. No, I think that's an interesting question, and I think Singapore's approach has always been that you need rehabilitation, and I think globally as well. You can't, if you have someone, you detain him for 2 to 10 years for any number of offenses, and you don't have a effective program to help him while he is in prison. He's likely to go out and come back, and he's likely to go, when he's released, he's more likely to end up in prison again. And I think that's always been a problem in most societies, ours included, right? The sort of recidivism rate of people who when released end up in the system again has always been there. It's not a majority. But I think rehabilitation is always needed. The issue is also how do you rehabilitate a person and to what extent, right? I know the Singapore prisons have started this yellow ribbon campaign, which has gotten quite a lot of attention. Often because prisoners, when released, do find it hard to get jobs. Employers look at their qualifications, their past background, and the prisons and government have been working quite hard with a few of these with I think the public in the private sectors to raise awareness of this issue. But I think it's, in that sense, maybe rehabilitation's effectiveness might be limited. Yeah.
Thank you.
Right. You take.
Yeah, this is Ayush from NYGC again.
Sure.
As they say, history repeats itself. And speaking of recidivism, it has been a common trend for quite some time now that people often use religion to sort of back their political motives, such as Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen did back in the 80s, or even Saddam Hussein did in the 90s when there was the Gulf War. So, speaking of history repeating itself, are we observing similar trends in how ISIS is actually trying to occupy countries and using religion as a motivating factor for their troops? And what exactly are we doing as a global community to prevent such a tragedy from happening again?
That's a pretty broad question. I think there's you don't find any one country in the world that actually supports ISIS. It's naturally a threat to the existing order of things. I think there have been various measures. The White House pulled together this summit of mostly coalition countries in February. It's being discussed. I mean, there's at least a global meeting of one sort or other every month, in the run-up, in the next few months, to discuss this issue. And I think there's a consensus that, you've got to be quite clear. You also need a political solution, and unfortunately, the situation in Syria is quite messy because you had some countries initially back rebels to the current Syrian regime, right? And that actually allowed militants to come in and occupy the space. I don't see in a way. I think maybe tied to your question is how can the global community kind of completely defeat ISIS on the ground, right? And kind of
not just ISIS, but sort of breaking the paradigm that's been observed for such a while of a group using religion as a political motive, and the global community suppressing it with just brute force and just obliterating anything in its way. How can we sort of counter this, or what measures are we taking to counter this
abuse of
the same trend that we have observed for quite a while now?
Yeah. It's tough. I mean, you've got the religious establishment actually speaking out against it, right? A group of over 100 Muslim scholars have, from time to time, denounced ISIS and its use. You've got, top institutions in Cairo and elsewhere denouncing this abuse of religion. It's not. I mean, there are no quick answers. I think, but I think one solution probably lies in kind of addressing the causes that feed these grievances. And in one issue, it's in Syria, in even Saudi Arabia, Egypt. It's the issue of representation, right? People feel their governments are quite repressive and don't give them enough room to express themselves. I think trying to tackle some of that is one way. The other issue is tackling, I think, the development gap. I mean, one reason why the Arab Spring came about and a lot of these governments came under pressure was because they couldn't deliver economically, right, to their people. That's another way. I mean, I think countries like US are trying to tackle it by giving aid and development grants and so on. But when you do that, how much of that money ends up being used for the purposes it's used for, right?
Okay, thank you.
It's tough. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a
of course
there's a
there are no
straight
quick
answer, but I think
yeah,
tackling some of these root causes will help.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Now, who would be the brave soul? We have only 2 minutes. So anyone to take up the 2 minutes left of this Q&A? There we go. Female to the rescue, come.
Hello, I'm Rachel from SRJC, and my question is, you have presented to us the security threats that Singapore has faced in the past and faces presently. what new threats do you predict Singapore might face in the future?
That's a tough one. I think, I mean, well, I would say a major cyber attack could be would probably be the biggest threat to us. You know, given so much of our information is stored online or digitally, and um, but I think one other threat could be racial. I think racial or religious tension in our neighboring countries. I think that's another threat. But I think how do you call it? Extreme weather possibly could represent I think the toughest threat. And maybe we don't. I think we're trying to address it, but things like food security, right? If there's a prolonged drought in the region, especially, almost 100% of Singapore's food is imported from elsewhere, right? If there's a severe drought in the region and you see suddenly prices of things skyrocketing by 3 to 4 times, or not being available at all, I think that could be quite wide-ranging. Yeah.
I've also heard that Singapore is ranked one of the best in Asia for food stockage.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you think, how long would you think that Singapore would last if there would be a so-called, like what you have put, prolonged period of drought? How long do you think that this that Singapore would be safe from it?
I don't know.
I guess it depends on how much we have stocked up.
Yeah.
And we really don't know.
Yeah.
So I think it's difficult to arrive at a definite answer.
Yeah. If I can just add to that, I mean, things like frozen meat, it has a certain shelf life, right?
Yes.
Beyond a year and a half or two, maybe. But
Okay, thank you.
All right. We have come to the end of an interesting question and answer session. And I thank Mr. Hussein for doing the honors, and all of you for being such active participants. Thank you.